There is a silence that falls upon the soul after guilt, an echo, not of wrongdoing alone, but of something deeper. The rupture between who we are and who we were meant to be. Guilt, in the eyes of Carl Jung, was never merely a moral indictment. It was not simply the result of stepping outside of a social code. For Jung, guilt was sacred, tragic, transformative. It was the very beginning of individuation, the painful cracking open of the shell of collective identity. And in his 1916 lecture to the Psychological Club in Zurich, he did not mince words. The first step in individuation is tragic guilt. The accumulation of guilt demands expiation. Most modern psychological frameworks treat guilt as a symptom to be managed or removed. It's a glitch, a leftover from authoritarian upbringing or religious dogma. It is something we should talk ourselves out of, soothe with affirmations, or bury beneath productivity. But Jung didn't see it that way. To him, guilt was the entrance into the real work, the soul's descent into itself, because guilt points to something violated, something neglected, something deeply human that we have denied. It is the shadow knocking at the door. In his private journals and public works, Jung made clear that the person who refuses to face guilt also refuses to become an individual. Why? Because individuation is not self-improvement, it is self-confrontation. And the price of becoming whole is the recognition of what you have done to betray yourself, to conform to the crowd, to silence your inner truth. This guilt is not always about breaking commandments. It's about knowing you're living someone else's life. It's about lying to yourself so long that your soul sends signals through nightmares, obsessions, or psychosomatic illness. The guilt is encoded in the suffering. It whispers, "Something must die for you to be reborn." But we don't want to hear that. In today's world, the prevailing sentiment is to avoid guilt at all costs. We rush toward quick fixes, positivity, or external validation. But Jung warned us, without guilt, there is no crossing into the underworld of the soul. No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell, he said. And guilt is the shovel. It is the key that opens the descent. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung recounts how his own path to understanding the unconscious began with guilt. Not abstract guilt, but personal, paralyzing guilt over the tension between the role he was expected to play and the truth he felt emerging from within. His break with Freud was not just intellectual, it was moral. He felt he was betraying a father figure, yet he could not lie to himself any longer. That inner division between loyalty to Freud and loyalty to his own soul produced the kind of guilt that split him open. For months, he walked the shores of Lake Zurich in solitude, journaling visions, wrestling with dreams, and enduring what he called a confrontation with the unconscious. Guilt was the crucible. Without it, there would have been no Red Book, no shadow work, no archetypal psychology. And so we arrive at a paradox. Guilt is the disease and the cure. It wounds us and offers the thread to our healing, but only if we stop trying to fix it. Only if we learn to endure it, to hold it, to listen. Because guilt, when approached with reverence, becomes the voice of the self, the deeper self that demands we live truthfully no matter the cost. It asks not for our shame, but for our transformation. This is why Jung saw guilt not as something to eliminate, but something to integrate. Because guilt, when unconscious, turns to shame and self-destruction. But guilt, made conscious, becomes a guide. It becomes a moral compass, rooted not in external laws, but in the soul's own yearning for wholeness. Guilt, in the archetypal sense, emerges when the ego begins to suspect it is not the center of the universe. It is the psychic recoil of a self that has glimpsed its own mask. And in that glimpse, something within us breaks. The break is essential, because until the ego cracks, the unconscious cannot flow in, and guilt is often the first fracture. To Jung, this was not a metaphor but a psychological law. He observed in patient after patient that guilt signaled a threshold, a psychic moment when one could either regress into denial or begin the painful integration of the shadow. The people who refused guilt often remained stuck in neurosis. Their lives seemed rational on the surface, but beneath it was a suppressed chaos, symptoms with no clear source, vague depression, feelings of meaninglessness. But those who allowed guilt to speak, who risked their comfort and status for something deeper, became capable of real change. Jung once wrote that, "The shadow is a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down to the deep well." What he meant is that guilt is not incidental, it is initiatory. And initiations are, by definition, uncomfortable. They threaten your image of yourself. They ruin your sense of moral superiority. They reveal you to be capable of things you've long denied. But this is the beginning of real life. Not the curated performance, not the persona, but the raw, unfiltered truth of the self emerging from the unconscious. In the therapeutic process, Jung noticed that real breakthroughs did not come from catharsis alone. They came when a person realized that they had failed to live in accordance with something vital inside them, and that this failure required not explanation, but atonement, not in a religious sense, but in a psychological one. Atonement, from the root at one-ment, means to reconcile the split, to admit the betrayal, to begin the repair. Guilt, then, is not a punishment. It is the soul's longing for reconciliation with itself. One of the most overlooked aspects of Jung's view is that guilt is not only personal, it is also ancestral. He believed that some guilt does not belong to the individual in isolation, but emerges from the deeper layers of the collective unconscious. There are patterns of violence, repression, neglect, and pride passed down across generations. And often, the sensitive individual unconsciously absorbs this weight. Jung called this the burden of the ancestors, and he warned that if this inherited guilt is not confronted, it will act out in destructive ways, through repetition, projection, or fate. This is why he felt so strongly that modern society's dismissal of guilt was dangerous. Because without guilt, we cannot see the deeper structures that shape us. We cannot become conscious of what we've inherited, and we certainly cannot heal it. In his work on alchemy, Jung pointed to the symbol of the nigredo, the blackening, the decomposition, as the first phase of transformation. This psychic blackening, he said, often takes the form of guilt, the realization that I have been complicit in my own unconsciousness, I have betrayed something sacred within me. It is a dark night of the soul, but also the necessary prelude to rebirth. We are so eager to be free of guilt that we miss what it contains. Jung understood this. He knew that guilt, endured and understood, becomes wisdom. It gives us humility. It breaks our narcissism. It reminds us that the path to truth is paved with failure. Without guilt, we remain children, innocent only because we refuse to look. With guilt, we begin to grow. But to grow, one must suffer. Not gratuitously, but meaningfully. And guilt is meaningful suffering. It means something has been disturbed that should not have been ignored. That disturbance is not a pathology. It is the psyche calling you inward, not to wallow, but to reckon, not to punish, but to see, to really see what you've denied, what you've become, and what you might still be if you dare to change. Guilt, in this way, is a compass that only begins to function when we are still. And silence is not something we value. We drown it in noise, in consumption, and distraction. But the psyche doesn't forget. The soul doesn't forget. It waits, and when the time is right, it speaks through guilt. Jung warned us not to run from it, because running from guilt is running from your own soul. In the early years of his break from Freud, when he was unraveling not just theory but his own soul, Jung found himself swallowed by the unconscious. Dreams, visions, voices, all surged forth like an ancient tide. He did not repress them, he documented them, and in those journals, later known as the Black Books, we see a man not hiding from guilt, but conversing with it, wrestling with it, letting it guide him to the center of his being. One of the most haunting realizations Jung recorded was that the very process of becoming yourself would inevitably cause suffering to others. Individuation, he wrote, does not tolerate self-deception, and the most seductive deception of all is the fantasy of innocence, the belief that one can grow without breaking anything, that one can awaken without disturbing the people who benefit from your sleep. That myth, Jung said, is not only false, it is fatal, because the path to your real self is littered with corpses, the corpses of old identities, Old obligations, old attachments, you cannot carry them all with you, and when you drop them, when you say no to what once defined you, someone will always call you selfish. Someone will say, "You've changed." And in their eyes, you'll see a mirror of your guilt. The question is not whether it will appear. The question is whether you will face it. To live truthfully is to generate guilt. This is not a flaw of reality, but a function of it. Jung believed that any act of individuation, any real assertion of the self against the collective, would generate resistance, not just from society, but from within. That internal resistance is often guilt, but again, guilt is not the enemy. The enemy is what happens when you pretend it isn't there. When guilt is repressed, it festers, it becomes anxiety, it becomes projection, it becomes moral superiority. The person who cannot bear their own guilt becomes obsessed with the guilt of others. They point fingers, they moralize, they become cruel in the name of righteousness. Jung saw this clearly in the political movements of his day, and we can see it still now. The refusal to acknowledge one's own shadow creates the demand to scapegoat someone else's. But when guilt is accepted, when it is metabolized, it becomes a source of power, because it anchors you to the truth. You no longer have to be perfect. You no longer have to justify every part of your past. You no longer need to fake innocence. You stand, instead, as a flawed but honest participant in the drama of life. And in that stance, you become dangerous, not to the world, but to its illusions. To confront guilt is to become intimate with your own contradictions, to say, "I have lied, I have betrayed, I have failed. But I am willing to see it, to feel it, to integrate it." That act is rare, but it is also divine, because in that moment, you are no longer possessed by the guilt. You are no longer avoiding it or acting it out. You are holding it, and in holding it, you give birth to something new. Jung was not interested in purity. He was interested in wholeness, and wholeness includes guilt. Wholeness includes the parts of us that are ashamed, confused, broken. These parts are not barriers to the self, they are bridges to it, because the self, as Jung envisioned it, is not a perfect entity. It is a totality. It is the union of opposites. And that union cannot occur without guilt, because guilt shows us what we've excluded. It illuminates the shadows we've cast, and only by acknowledging those shadows can we begin to integrate them. That is why Jung spoke of guilt as tragic, not because it should be avoided, but because it reveals the inevitable tension between personal truth and collective expectation, between who you are and who they want you to be, between the inner command and the outer demand. This is the tragedy of all transformation, and to avoid it is to avoid life. Modern psychology, in its rush to soothe and sanitize, often treats guilt as a dysfunction, a problem to be eliminated. But Jung knew better. He knew that guilt, when honored, is sacred, that it leads us back to what is real, that it reminds us that we are responsible, not just for our actions, but for our avoidance, not just for our mistakes, but for the ways we silence our conscience. He knew that guilt, if endured consciously, becomes the birthplace of meaning. The modern world is allergic to guilt. It manufactures distractions to drown it. Quick fixes, ideological purities, therapeutic numbing, social media confessions masked as performances of self-awareness. But Jung saw through it all. He warned that the refusal to feel guilt is not healing, it is dismemberment, a splitting of the psyche into polished masks and hidden wounds. We think we are freeing ourselves by bypassing guilt, but we are only imprisoning our deeper self, the self that longs to be whole, not good. And there is a difference. Good is what the world demands. Whole is what the soul demands. And the soul is never interested in perfection. It is interested in integration. In the Red Book, Jung dramatizes a confrontation with his own soul. He meets figures that terrify him. He meets Salome, the blind temptress, and Elijah, the prophet, symbols of the irrational and the ancient within him. He doesn't fight them. He speaks with them. He listens. He follows. This is not the posture of someone trying to maintain innocence. This is the posture of someone willing to undergo psychic death. And guilt, in Jung's symbolic cosmos, is one of death's emissaries. You feel guilt not just because you did something wrong. You feel guilt because something in you is being torn away, some image of yourself, some illusion of virtue. That tearing hurts, it feels like failure, but it's birth, and all real birth includes blood. In his essay, The Spiritual Problem of Modern Man, Jung describes the alienation of individuals who live in advanced societies but have lost all contact with the symbolic. They're not grounded in myth, ritual, or personal transformation. Instead, they seek distraction or ideological belonging. But these substitutes do not eliminate guilt. They only displace it. And displaced guilt, like an orphaned ghost, haunts everything. It shows up in irrational rage, in collective hysteria, in unconscious sabotage. Jung knew that if guilt is not faced individually, it will erupt collectively. And this is no metaphor. In the years before World War II, Jung observed the shadows growing in Germany, the collective projection of evil onto groups, the frenzy to purify, to cleanse, to dominate. He was horrified, but not surprised. He knew what happens when a society refuses to face its guilt. It finds someone else to blame. The Jews, the heretics, the immigrants, the dissidents, always someone else. Because the guilt we refuse to feel must find a home. And it always finds one, in someone weaker, someone different, someone convenient. Jung's remedy was not political, it was psychological. Each person must face their own inner split. Each person must integrate their shadow. And that process always begins with guilt, not shame, not moral panic, but guilt, the quiet, searing knowledge that we are responsible for what we have done and what we have avoided. And through that responsibility, something awakens. When you feel guilt without collapsing into it, when you carry it like a chalice rather than a chain, it becomes initiation. You enter the mystery of your own depth. You see the limits of your ego. You begin to respect the weight of your own choices, and in that reverence, humility grows. Not the humility of self-deprecation, but the humility of presence, of maturity, of soul. There is no true individuation without guilt, because without guilt, you have not yet chosen yourself. You are still trying to please, still trying to protect your image, still editing your soul for social approval. But the self, the archetypal self, does not care about your reputation. It cares about your reality. And your reality includes your betrayals, your secrets, your wounds, your guilt. Jung was unafraid to say this. He lived it. He made mistakes. He struggled. He lost friendships. He wandered in madness. But he did not run. He went deeper. And from that descent he brought back gold, not platitudes but symbols, not doctrines but dreams, not excuses but invitations, to look inward, to feel guilt, and to find, within that guilt, a thread leading back to the divine. Because that is the paradox. Guilt can alienate us from the world, but it can reunite us with the self. It breaks our identification with roles, masks, and expectations. And in that breaking, the real begins. The person who avoids guilt avoids their own becoming, but the one who embraces it becomes a vessel for truth. In his 1916 lecture, Jung gave voice to what most of modern psychology still resists. He said, "The first step in individuation is tragic guilt. The accumulation of guilt demands expiation. Not avoidance, not redirection, not rationalization. Expiation. A word that feels foreign today. It means atonement, a purification through pain, not for the sake of shame, but for the birth of a new self." Tragic guilt is not neurotic. It is existential. It is not about violating social rules, but about realizing we have failed ourselves, failed to live the life only we could have lived. It arises the moment we recognize that our borrowed personas no longer fit, that our loyalty to family, culture, or tribe has cost us something sacred, our inner truth. This is why Jung placed guilt at the beginning of individuation. It is the crack in the mirror, the moment the reflection fractures. You were the good son, the successful man, the proper woman. You were polite, agreeable, even admired. But something in you began to whisper, "This is not your life. This is not your voice." And when you finally listen, you break an old vow. You betray the collective in order to serve the soul. That betrayal leaves behind guilt. Not because you did something objectively wrong, but because you stepped out of the dream that others depended on. You disturbed the pattern. You rejected the inheritance. And even if you were right to do so, especially if you were, you must carry the weight of what that costs. This is why many never awaken. They cannot bear that first rupture. They cannot bear to feel the guilt that comes with becoming real. But Jung says, bear it, and not only bear it, honor it, because that guilt is proof that your transformation is genuine. It is not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It is not adolescent rage. It is the ache of responsibility, the sacred pain of one who is finally choosing to live from the center. You cannot skip this stage. If you avoid it, you will seek substitutes, a partner to blame, a group to shame, a system to resent. These things might soothe the ego, but they starve the soul. Because the soul does not want soothing, it wants truth. And guilt, tragic guilt, is a signal that truth has entered the room. The modern mind wants to treat guilt like a disease, but Jung treats it like a rite of passage. Just as the shaman descends into the underworld to retrieve the lost fragment of the tribe's soul, so too must the modern individual descend into guilt to retrieve their own. This is not theology, this is depth psychology, and yet it sounds holy, because it is. Not religious in the traditional sense, but sacred in the archetypal sense. The process of owning your darkness and walking through it is as old as myth, as universal as dreams. And guilt is one of its earliest companions. When you stop seeing guilt as a problem and start seeing it as a guide, your entire life changes. You stop asking, how do I get rid of this feeling? And start asking, what is this feeling asking me to become? That is the moment of power. The moment you become the pilgrim instead of the patient, the one who seeks rather than the one who suffers in denial. Carl Jung walked this path. He walked it trembling, unsure, but faithful to what he called the inner necessity. And through it, he emerged with a vision, not just of psychology, but of human destiny. A vision in which guilt is not the enemy of freedom, but the portal to it. If you are feeling guilt right now, not the manipulative guilt imposed by others, but the raw, quiet, tragic kind, then perhaps you are closer to your true self than you realize. Perhaps you are standing at the threshold. Do not turn away, because the way forward is not back into comfort, but deeper into courage. Let your guilt speak. Let it burn. Let it teach you what must die in order for you to live. Then, in the ashes, watch carefully. You might see the first light of your real becoming.